Chapter 23 of the Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 23. Seaman did not at once start on his mission to the Princess. He made his way instead to the servants' quarters and knocked at the door of the butler's sitting room. There was no reply. He tried the handle in vain. The door was locked. A tall, grave-faced man in sombre black came out from an adjoining apartment. "You are looking for the person who arrived this morning from abroad, sir?" he inquired. "I am," Seaman replied. "Has he locked himself in?" "He has left the hall, sir." "Left?" Seaman repeated. "Do you mean gone away for good?" "Apparently, sir. I do not understand his language myself, but I believe he considered his reception here, for some reason or another, unfavourable. He took advantage of the car which went down to the station for the evening papers and caught the last train." Seaman was silent for a moment. The news was a shock to him. "What is your position here?" he asked his informant. "My name is Reynolds, sir," was the respectful reply. "I am Mr. Pelham's servant." "Can you tell me why, if this man has left, the door here is locked?" "Mr. Parkins locked it before he went out, sir. He accompanied Mr. Miller, I think his name was, to the station." Seaman had the air of a man not wholly satisfied. "Is it usual to lock up a sitting-room in this fashion?" he asked. "Mr. Parkins always does it, sir. The cabinets of cigars are kept there, also the wine-cellar key and the key of the plate-chest. None of the other servants use the room except at Mr. Parkins' invitation." "I understand," Seaman said as he turned away. "Much obliged for your information, Reynolds. I will speak to Mr. Parkins later. I will let him know that you desire to see him, sir. Good night, Reynolds." "Good night, sir." Seaman passed back again to the crowded hall and billiard room, exchanged a few remarks here and there, and made his way up the southern flight of stairs toward the west wing. Stephanie consented without hesitation to receive him. She was seated in front of the fire, reading a novel, in a boudoir opening out of her bedroom. "Princess," Seaman declared with a low bow, "we are in despair at your desertion." She put down her book. "I have been insulted in this house," she said. "To-morrow I leave it." Seaman shook his head reproachfully. "Your Highness," he continued, "believe me, I do not wish to presume upon my position. I am only a German tradesman, admitted to the circles like these for reasons connected solely with the welfare of my country. Yet I know much, as it happens, of the truth of this matter, the matter which is causing you distress. I beg you to reconsider your decision. Our friend here is, I think, needlessly hard upon himself. So much the greater will be his reward when the end comes. So much the greater will be the rapture with which he will throw himself on his knees before you." "Has he sent you to reason with me?" "Not directly. I am to a certain extent, however, his major domo in this enterprise. I brought him from Africa. I have watched over him from the start. 2 brains are better than 1. I try to show him where to avoid mistakes. I try to point out the paths of danger and of safety." "I should imagine Sir Everard finds you useful," she remarked calmly. "I hope he does." "It has doubtless occurred to you," she continued, "that our friend has accommodated himself wonderfully to English life and customs." "You must remember that he was educated here. Nevertheless, his aptitude has been marvellous." "One might almost call it supernatural," she agreed. "Tell me, Mr. Seaman, you seem to have been completely successful in the installation of our friend here as Sir Everard. What is going to be his real value to you? What work will he do?" "We are keeping him for the big things. You have seen our gracious master lately?" he added hesitatingly. "I know what is at the back of your mind," she replied. "Yes, before the summer is over I am to pack up my trunks and fly. I understand." "It is when that time comes," Seaman said impressively, "that we expect Sir Everard Dominey, the typical English country gentleman, of whose loyalty there has never been a word of doubt, to be of use to us. Most of our present helpers will be under suspicion. The authorized staff of our Secret Service can only work underneath. You can see for yourself the advantage we gain in having a confidential correspondent who can, day by day, reflect the changing psychology of the British mind in all its phases. We have quite enough of the other sort of help arranged for. Plans of ships, aerodromes at harbours, sailings of convoys, calling up of soldiers, all these are the ABC of our Secret Service profession. We shall never ask our friend here for a single fact, but from his town house in Berkeley Square, the host of cabinet ministers, of soldiers, of the best brains of the country, our fingers will never leave the pulse of Britain's day-by-day life. Stephanie threw herself back in her easy-chair and clasped her hands behind her head. These things you are expecting from our present host? We are, and we expect to get them. I have watched him day by day. My confidence in him has grown. Stephanie was silent. She sat looking into the fire. Seaman, keenly observant as always, realized the change in her, yet found something of mystery in her new detachment of manner. "Your Highness," he urged, "I am not here to speak on behalf of the man who at heart is, I know, your lover. He will plead his own cause when the time comes. But I am here to plead for patience. I am here to implore you to take no rash step, to do nothing which might imperil in any way his position here. I stand outside the gates of the world which your sex can make a paradise. I am no judge of the things that happen here. But in your heart I feel there is bitterness, because the man for whom you care has chosen to place his country first. I implore your patience, Princess. I implore you to believe what I know so well, that it is the sternest sense of duty only which is the foundation of Leopold von Ragastein's obdurate attitude." "What are you afraid that I shall do?" she asked curiously. "I am afraid of nothing, directly." "Indirectly, then. Answer me, please." "I am afraid," he admitted frankly, "that in some corner of the world, if not in this country, you might whisper a word, a scoffing or an angry sentence, which would make people wonder what grudge you had against the simple Norfolk baronet. I would not like that word to be spoken in the presence of any one who knew your history and realized the rather amazing likeness between Sir Everard Dominey and Baron Leopold von Ragastein." "I see," Stephanie murmured, a faint smile parting her lips. "Well, Mr. Seaman, I do not think that you need have many fears. What I shall carry away with me in my heart is not for you or any man to know. In a few days I shall leave this country." "You are going back to Berlin? To Hungary?" She shook her head, beckoned her maid to open the door, and held out her hand in token of dismissal. "I am going to take a sea voyage," she announced. "I shall go to Africa." The morrow was a day of mild surprises. Eddie Pelham's empty place was the first to attract notice towards the end of breakfast time. "Where's the pink and white immaculate?" the right honourable gentleman asked. "I missed my morning wonder as to how he tied his tie." "Gone," Dominey replied, looking round from the sideboard. "Gone?" everyone repeated. "I should think such a thing has never happened to him before," Dominey observed. "He was wanted in town." "Fancy any one wanting Eddie for any serious purpose," Caroline murmured. "Fancy any one wanting him badly enough to drag him out of bed in the middle of the night with a telephone call and send him up to town by the breakfast train from Norwich," their host continued. "I thought we had started a new ghost when he came into my room in a purple dressing gown and broke the news." "Who wanted him?" the Duke inquired. "His tailor?" "Business of importance was his pretext," Dominey replied. There was a little ripple of good-humoured laughter. "Does Eddie do anything for a living?" Caroline asked, yawning. "Mr. Pelham is a director of the Chelsea Motor Works," Mangan told them. "He received a small legacy last year, and his favourite taxicab man was the first to know about it." "You're not suggesting," she exclaimed, "that it is business of that sort which has taken Eddie away?" "I should think it most improbable," Mangan confessed. "As a matter of fact, he asked me the other day if I knew where their premises were." "We shall miss him," she acknowledged. "It was quite one of the events of the day to see his costume after shooting." "His bridge was reasonably good," the Duke commented. "He shot rather well the last 2 days," Mangan remarked. "And he had told me confidentially," Caroline concluded, "that he was going to wear brown to-day. Now, I think Eddy would have looked nice in brown." The missing young man's requiem was finished by the arrival of the local morning papers. A few moments later Dominey rose and left the room. Seaman, who had been unusually quiet, followed him. "My friend," he confided, "I do not know whether you have heard, but there was a curious disappearance from the Hall last night." "Whose?" Dominey asked, pausing in the act of selecting a cigarette. "Our friend Miller, or Wolff, Dr. Schmidt's emissary," Seaman announced, "has disappeared." "Disappeared?" Dominey repeated. "I suppose he is having a prowl round somewhere." "I have left it to you to make more careful enquiries," Seaman replied. "All I can tell you is that I made up my mind last night to interview him once more and try to fathom his very mysterious behaviour. I found the door of your butler's sitting-room locked, and a very civil fellow, Mr. Pelham's valet he turned out to be, tell me that he had left in the car which went for the evening papers." "I will go and make some inquiries," Dominey decided, after a moment's puzzled consideration. "If you please," Seaman acquiesced. "The affair disconcerts me because I do not understand it. When there is a thing which I do not understand, I am uncomfortable." Dominey vanished into the nether regions, spent half an hour with Rosamund, and saw nothing of his disturbed guest again until they were walking to the first wood. They had a moment together after Dominey had pointed out the stands. "Well?" Seaman enquired. "Our friend," Dominey announced, "apparently made up his mind to go quite suddenly. A bed was arranged for him, or rather it is always there, in a small apartment opening out of the butler's room on the ground floor. He said nothing about leaving until he saw Parkins preparing to go down to the station with the chauffeur. Then he insisted upon accompanying him, and when he found there was a train to Norwich, he simply bade them both good night. He left no message whatever for either you or me." Seaman was thoughtful. "There is no doubt," he said, "that his departure was indicative of a certain distrust in us. He came to find out something, and I suppose he found it out. I envy you your composure, my friend. We live on the brink of a volcano, and you shoot pheasants." "We will try for a partridge for a change," Dominey observed, swinging around as a single Frenchman with a dull whizz crossed the hedge behind them and fell a little distance away, a crumpled heap of feathers. "Neat, I think," he added, turning to his companion. "Marvellous," Seaman replied with faint sarcasm. "I envy your nerve." "I cannot take this matter very seriously," Dominey acknowledged. "The fellow seemed to me quite harmless." "My anxieties have also been aroused in another direction," Seaman confided. "Any other trouble looming?" Dominey asked. "You will find yourself minus another guest when you return this afternoon." "The Princess?" "The Princess," Seaman assented. "I did my best with her last night, but I found her in a most peculiar frame of mind. We are to be relieved of any anxiety concerning her for some time, however. She has decided to take a sea voyage." "Where to?" "Africa." Dominey paused in the act of inserting a cartridge into his gun. He turned slowly around and looked into his companion's expressionless face. "Why the mischief is she going out there?" he asked. "I can tell you no more than that," Seaman replied, "than why Johann Wolff was sent over here to spy upon our perfect work. I am most unhappy, my friend. The things which I understand, however threatening they are, I do not fear. Things which I do not understand oppress me." Dominey laughed quietly. "Come," he said, "there is nothing here which seriously threatens our position. The Princess is angry, but she is not likely to give us away. This man Wolff could make no adverse report about either of us. We are doing our job, and doing it well. Let our clear consciences console us." "That is well," Seaman replied, "but I feel uneasy. I must not stay here longer. Too intimate an association between you and me is unwise." "Well, I think I can be trusted," Dominey observed. even if I am to be left alone." "In every respect except as regards the Princess," Seaman admitted. "Your deportment has been most discreet." "Except as regards the Princess," Dominey repeated irritably. "Really, my friend, I cannot understand your point of view in this matter. You could not expect me to mix up a secret honeymoon with my present commitments." "There must surely have been some middle way," Seaman persisted. "You show so much tact in other matters." "You do not know the Princess," Dominey muttered. Rosamund joined them for luncheon, bringing news of Stephanie's sudden departure, with notes and messages for everybody. Caroline made a little grimace at her host. "You're in trouble," she whispered in his ear. "All the same, I approve. I like Stephanie, but she is an exceedingly dangerous person." "I wonder whether she is," Dominey mused. "I think men have generally found her so," Caroline replied. "She had one wonderful love affair which ended, as you know, in her husband being killed in a duel and her lover being banished from the country. Still, she's not quite the sort of woman to be content with a banished lover. I fancied I noticed distinct signs of her being willing to replace him whilst she has been down here." "I feel as though a blight had settled upon my house party," Dominey remarked with bland irrelevancy. "First Eddy, then Mr. Ludwig Miller, and now Stephanie." "And who on earth was Mr. Ludwig Miller, after all?" Caroline inquired. "He was a fat, flaxen-haired German who brought me messages from old friends in Africa. He had no luggage but a walking stick, and he seems to have upset the male part of my domestics last night by accepting a bed and then disappearing." "With the plate?" "Not a thing missing. Parkins spent an agonized half-hour counting everything. Mr. Ludwig appears to be one of those unsolved mysteries which go to make up an imperfect world." "Well, we've had a jolly time," Caroline said reminiscently. "Tomorrow Henry and I are off, and I suppose the others. I must say on the whole I am delighted with our visit." "You are very gracious," Dominey murmured. "I came, perhaps, expecting to see a little more of you," she went on deliberately, "but there is a very great compensation for my disappointment. I think your wife, Everard, is worth taking trouble about. She is perfectly sweet, and her manners are most attractive." "I am very glad you think that," he said warmly. She looked away from him. "Everard," she sighed, "I believe you are in love with your wife." There was a strange, almost a terrible mixture of expressions in his face as he answered. A certain fear, a certain fondness, a certain almost desperate resignation. Even his voice, as a rule so slow and measured, shook with an emotion which amazed his companion. "I believe I am," he muttered. "I am afraid of my feelings for her. It may bring even another tragedy down upon us." "Don't talk rubbish!" Caroline exclaimed. "What tragedy could come between you now? You've recovered your balance. You are a strong, steadfast person, just fitted to be the protector of anything so sweet and charming as Rosamund. Tragedy, indeed! Why don't you take her down to the south of France, Everard, and have your honeymoon all over again?" "I can't do that just yet." She studied him curiously. There were times when he seemed wholly incomprehensible to her. "Are you still worried about that Unthank affair?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment. "There is still an aftermath to our troubles," he told her. "One cloud which leans over us. I shall clear it up in time, but other things may happen first." "You take yourself very seriously, Everard," she observed, looking at him with a puzzled expression. "One would think that there was a side of your life, and a very important one, which you kept entirely to yourself. Why do you have that funny little man, Seaman, always round with you? You're not being blackmailed or anything, are you?" "On the contrary," he told her, "Seaman was the first founder of my fortunes." She shrugged her shoulders. "I have made a little money once or twice on the Stock Exchange," she remarked, "but I didn't have to carry my broker about in my pocket afterwards." "Seaman is a good-hearted little fellow, and he loves companionship. He will drift away presently, and one won't see anything of him for ages." Henry began to wonder, she concluded drily, whether you were going to stand for Parliament on the Anglo-German alliance ticket." Dominey laughed as he caught Middleton's reproachful eye in the doorway of the farmer's kitchen in which they were hunching. He gave the signal to rise. "I have had some thoughts of Parliament," he admitted. "But, well, Henry need not worry." End of chapter 23. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 24 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 24. The next morning saw the breaking up of Dominey's carefully arranged shooting party. The Prince took his host's arm and led him to one side for a few moments as the cars were being loaded up. His first few words were of formal thanks. He spoke then more intimately. "Von Ragastein," he said, "I desire to refer back for a moment to our conversation the other day." Dominey shook his head and glanced behind. "I know only one name here, Prince." "Dominey, then. I will confess that you play and carry the part through perfectly. I have known English gentlemen all my life, and you have the trick of the thing. But listen, I have already told you of my disapproval of this scheme in which you are the central figure." "It is understood," Dominey assented. "That," the Prince continued, "is a personal matter. What I am now going to say to you is official. I had dispatches from Berlin last night. They concern you." Dominey seemed to stiffen a little. "Well?" "I am given to understand," the Ambassador continued, "that you practically exist only in the event of that catastrophe which I, for one, cannot foresee. I am assured that if your exposé should take place at any time, your personation will be regarded as a private enterprise, and there is nothing whatever to connect you with any political work." "Up to the present that is absolutely so," Dominey agreed. "I am further advised to look upon you as my unnamed and unsuspected successor here, in the event of war. For that reason I am begged to inaugurate terms of intimacy with you, to treat you with the utmost confidence, and, if the black end should come, to leave in your hands all such unfulfilled work as can be continued in secrecy and silence. I perhaps express myself in a somewhat confused manner." "I understand perfectly," Dominey replied. "The authorities have changed their first idea as to my presence here. They want to keep every shadow of suspicion away from me, so that in the event of war I shall have an absolutely unique position, an unsuspected yet fervently patriotic German, living hand in glove with the upper classes of English society. One can well imagine that there would be work for me." "Our understanding is mutual," Terniloff declared. "What I have to say to you, therefore, is that I hope you will soon follow us to London and give me the opportunity of offering you the constant hospitality of Carlton House Gardens." "You are very kind, Prince," Dominey said. "My instructions are, as soon as I have consolidated my position here, an event which I fancy I may consider attained, to establish myself in London and to await orders. I trust that amongst other things you will then permit me to examine the memoirs you spoke of the other day." "Naturally, and with the utmost pleasure," the Ambassador assented. "They are a faithful record of my interviews and negotiations with certain ministers here, and they reflect a desire and intention for peace which will, I think, amaze you. I venture now upon a somewhat delicate question," he continued, changing the subject of their conversation abruptly, as they turned back along the terrace. "Lady Dominey will accompany you?" "Of that I am not sure," Dominey replied thoughtfully. "I have noticed, Prince, if I may be allowed to say so, your chivalrous regard for that lady. You will permit me to assure you that in the peculiar position in which I am placed, I shall never forget that she is the wife of Everard Dominey." Terniloff shook hands heartily. "I wanted to hear that from you," he admitted. "You, I felt instinctively, were different, but there are many men of our race who are willing enough to sacrifice a woman without the slightest scruple, either for their passions or their policy. I find Lady Dominey charming. She will never lack a protector in me," Dominey declared. There were more farewells, and soon after the little procession of cars drove off. Rosamund herself was on the terrace, bidding all her guests farewell. She clung to Dominey's arm when at last they turned back into the empty hall. "What dear people they were, Everard!" she exclaimed. "I only wish that I had seen more of them. The Duchess was perfectly charming to me, and I never knew any one with such delightful manners as Prince Terniloff. Are you going to miss them very much, dear?" "Not a bit," he answered. "I think I shall take a gun now and stroll down the meadows and across the rough ground. Will you come with me, or will you put on one of your pretty gowns and entertain me downstairs at luncheon? It is a very long time since we had a meal alone together." She shook her head a little sadly. "We never have had," she answered. "You know that, Everard, and alas, I know it. But we are going on pretending, aren't we?" He raised her fingers to his lips and kissed them. "You shall pretend all that you like, dear Rosamund," he promised, "and I will be the shadow of your desires. No, no tears," he added quickly, as she turned away. "Remember, there is nothing but happiness for you now. Whoever I am, or am not, that is my one aim in life." She clutched at his hand passionately, and suddenly, as though finding it insufficient, twined her arms around his neck and kissed him. "Let me come with you," she begged. "I can't bear to let you go. I'll be very quiet. Will you wait 10 minutes for me?" "Of course," he answered. He strolled down towards the gun-room, stood by the fire for a moment, and then wandered out into the courtyard, where Middleton and a couple of beaters were waiting for him with the dogs. He had scarcely taken a step towards them, however, when he stopped short. To his amazement, Seaman was there, standing a little on one side, with his eyes fixed upon the windows of the servants' quarters. "Hello, my friend!" he exclaimed. "Why, I thought you went by the early train from Thursford Station." "Missed it by 2 minutes," Seaman replied, with a glance towards the beaters. "I knew all the cars were full for the 11 o'clock, so I thought I'd wait till the afternoon." "And where have you been to for the last few hours, then?" Seaman had reached his side now, and was out of earshot of the others. "Trying to solve the mystery of Johann Wolff's sudden departure last night. Come and walk down the avenue with me a short way." "A very short distance, then. I am expecting Lady Dominey." They passed through the thin iron gates and paced along one of the back entrances to the hall. "Do not think me indiscreet," Seaman began. "I returned without the knowledge of any one, and I kept out of the way until they had all gone. It is what I told you before. Things which I do not understand depress me, and behold, I have found proof this morning of a further significance in Wolff's sudden departure." "Proceed," Dominey begged. "I learned this morning, entirely by accident, that Mr. Pelham's servant was either mistaken or willfully deceived me. Wolff did not accompany your butler to the station." "And how did you find that out?" Dominey demanded. "It is immaterial. What is material is that there is a sort of conspiracy amongst the servants here to conceal the manner of his leaving. Do not interrupt me, I beg. Early this morning there was a fresh fall of snow, which has now disappeared. Outside the window of the room which I found locked were the marks of footsteps and the tracks of a small car." "And what do you gather from all this?" Dominey asked. "I gather that Wolff must have had friends in the neighbourhood," Seaman replied. "Or else—" "Well?" "My last supposition sounds almost absurd," Seaman confessed, "but the whole matter is so incomprehensible that I was going to say, or else he was forcibly removed." Dominey laughed softly. "Wolff would scarcely have been an easy man to abduct, would he?" he remarked, "even if we could hit upon any plausible reason for such a thing. As a matter of fact, Seaman," he concluded, turning on his heel a little abruptly as he saw Rosamund standing in the avenue, "I cannot bring myself to treat this Johann Wolff business seriously. Granted that the man was a spy. Well, let him get on with it. We are doing our job here in the most perfect and praiseworthy fashion. We neither of us have the ghost of a secret to hide from his employers." "In a sense that is true," Seaman admitted. "Well, then, cheer up," Dominey enjoined. "Take a little walk with us, and we will see whether Parkins cannot find us a bottle of that old Burgundy for lunch. How does that sound?" "If you will excuse me from taking the walk," Seaman begged, "I would like to remain here until your return." "You are more likely to do harm," Dominey reminded him, "and set the servants talking if you show too much interest in this man's disappearance." "I shall be careful," Seaman promised, "but there are certain things which I cannot help. I work always from instinct, and my instinct is never wrong. I will ask no more questions of your servants, but I know that there is something mysterious about the sudden departure of Johann Wolff." Dominey and Rosamund returned about 1 o'clock to find a note from Seaman, which the former tore open as his companion stood warming her feet in front of the fire. There were only a few lines. "I am following an idea. It takes me to London. Let us meet there within a few days. S." "Has he really gone?" Rosamund asked. "Back to London." She laughed happily. "Then we shall lunch à deux after all. Delightful! I have my wish." There was a sudden glow in Dominey's face, a glow which was instantly suppressed. "Shall I ever have mine?" he asked, with a queer little break in his voice. Chapter 24. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 25 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 25. Terniloff and Dominey, one morning about 6 months later, lounged underneath a great elm tree at Ranelagh, having iced drinks after a round of golf. Several millions of perspiring Englishmen were at the same moment studying with dazed wonder the headlines in the midday papers. "I suppose," the Ambassador remarked as he leaned back in his chair with an air of lazy content, "that I am being accused of fiddling while Rome burns." "Everyone has certainly not your confidence in the situation," Dominey rejoined calmly. "There is no one else who knows quite so much," Terniloff reminded him. Dominey sipped his drink for a moment or two in silence. "Have you the latest news of the Russian mobilization?" he asked. "They had some startling figures in the city this morning." The Prince waved his hand. "My faith is not founded on these extraneous incidents," he replied. "If Russia mobilizes, it is for defense. No nation in the world would dream of attacking Germany, nor has Germany the slightest intention of imperiling her coming supremacy amongst the nations by such crude methods as military enterprise. Servia must be punished, naturally, but to that in principle every nation in Europe is agreed. We shall not permit Austria to overstep the mark." "You are at least consistent, Prince," Dominey remarked. Terniloff smiled. "That is because I have been taken behind the scenes," he said. "I have been shown, as is the privilege of ambassadors, the mind of our rulers. You, my friend," he went on, "spent your youth amongst the military faction. You think that you are the most important people in Germany. Well, you are not. The Kaiser has willed it otherwise. By the by, I had yesterday a most extraordinary cable from Stephanie." Dominey ceased swinging his putter carelessly over the head of a daisy and turned his head to listen. "Is she on the way home?" "She is due in Southampton at any moment now. She wants to know where she can see me immediately upon her arrival, as she has information of the utmost importance to give me." "Did she ever tell you the reason for her journey to Africa?" "She was most mysterious about it. If such an idea had had any logical outcome, I should have surmised that she was going there to seek information as to your past." "She gave Seaman the same idea," Dominey observed. "I scarcely see what she has to gain. In Africa, as a matter of fact," he went on, "my life would bear the strictest investigation." "The whole affair is singularly foolish," the Prince declared. Still, I am not sure that you have been altogether wise. Even accepting your position, I see no reason why you should not have obeyed the Kaiser's behest. My experience of your society here is that love affairs between men and women moving in the same circles are not uncommon." "That," Dominey urged, "is when they are all tarred with the same brush. My behaviour towards Lady Dominey has been culpable enough as it is. To have placed her in the position of a neglected wife would have been indefensible. Further, it might have affected the position which it is in the interest of my work that I should maintain here." "An old subject," the Ambassador sighed, "best not be rediscussed. Behold our womenkind!" Rosamund and the Princess had issued from the house, and the two men hastened to meet them. The latter looked charming, exquisitely gowned, and stately in appearance. By her side, Rosamund, dressed with the same success but in younger fashion, seemed almost like a child. They passed into the luncheon-room, crowded with many little parties of distinguished and interesting people, brilliant with the red livery of the waiters, the profusion of flowers, all that nameless elegance which had made the place society's most popular rendezvous. The women, as they settled into their places, asked the question which was on the lips of a great many English people of that day. "Is there any news?" Terniloff perhaps felt that he was the cynosure of many eager and anxious eyes. He smiled light-heartedly as he answered, "None. If there were, I am convinced that it would be good. I have been allowed to play out my titanic struggle against Sir Everard without interruption." "I suppose the next important question to whether it is to be peace or war is, how did you play?" the Princess asked. "I surpassed myself," her husband replied. "But of course no ordinary human golfer is of any account against Dominey. He plays far too well for any self-respecting The Ambassador broke off and paused while he helped himself to mayonnaise. "For any self-respecting German to play against," he concluded. Luncheon was a very pleasant meal, and a good many people noticed the vivacity of the beautiful Lady Dominey, whose picture was beginning to appear in the illustrated papers. Afterwards they drank coffee and sipped liqueurs under the great elm tree on the lawn, listening to the music and congratulating themselves upon having made their escape from London. In the ever-shifting panorama of gaily dressed women and flannel-clad men, the monotony of which was varied here and there by the passing of a diplomatist or a Frenchman, scrupulously attired in morning clothes, were many familiar faces. Caroline and a little group of friends waved to them from the terrace. Eddie Pelham, in immaculate white and a long tennis coat with dark blue edgings, paused to speak to them on his way to the courts. "How is the motor business, Eddie?" Dominey asked, with a twinkle in his eyes. "So-so. I'm not quite so keen as I was. To tell you the truth," the young man confided, glancing around and lowering his voice so that no one should share the momentous information, "I was lucky enough to pick up a small share in Jerry Moore's racing stable at Newmarket the other day. I fancy I know a little more about GGs than I do about the inside of motors. What?" "I should think very possibly that you are right," Dominey assented, as the young man passed on with a farewell salute. Terniloff looked after him curiously. "It is the type of young man that," he declared, "which we cannot understand. What would happen to him in the event of a war? In the event of his being called upon, say, either to fight or do some work of national importance for his country?" "I expect he would do it," Dominey replied. "He would do it pluckily, wholeheartedly, and badly. He is a type of the upper-class young Englishman, over-sanguine and entirely undisciplined. They expect, and their country expects for them, that in the case of emergency pluck would take the place of training." The Right Honourable Gerald Watson stood upon the steps talking to the wife of the Italian Ambassador. She left him presently, and he came strolling down the lawn with his hands behind his back and his eyes seeming to see out past the golf links. "There goes a man," Terniloff murmured, "who lately I have found changed. When I first came here he met me quite openly. I believe even now He is sincerely desirous of peace and amicable relations between our two countries. And yet something has fallen between us. I cannot tell what it is. I cannot tell even of what nature it is. But I have an instinct for people's attitudes towards me, and the English are the worst race in the world at hiding their feelings. Has Mr. Watson, I wonder, come under the spell of your connection, the Duke of Worcester? He seemed so friendly with both of us down in Norfolk." Their womenkind left them at that moment to talk to some acquaintances seated a short distance away. Mr. Watson, passing within a few yards of them, was brought to a standstill by Dominey's greeting. They talked for a moment or two upon idle subjects. "Your news, I trust, continues favourable?" the Ambassador remarked, observing the etiquette which required him to be the first to leave the realms of ordinary conversation. "It is a little negative in quality," the other answered, after a moment's hesitation. "I am summoned to Downing Street again at 6 o'clock." "I have already confided the result of my morning dispatches to the Prime Minister," Terniloff observed. "I went through them before I came down here," was the somewhat doubtful reply. "You will have appreciated, I hope, their genuinely pacific tone?" Terniloff asked anxiously. His interlocutor bowed and then drew himself up. It was obvious that the strain of the last few days was telling upon him. There were lines about his mouth, and his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "Words are idle things to deal with at a time like this," he said. "One thing, however, I will venture to say to you, Prince, here and under these circumstances. There will be no war, unless it be the will of your country." Terniloff was for a moment unusually pale. It was an episode of unrecorded history. He rose to his feet and raised his hat. "There will be no war," he said solemnly. The Cabinet Minister passed on with a lighter step. Dominey, more clearly than ever before, understood the subtle policy which had chosen for his great position a man as chivalrous and faithful and yet as simple-minded as Terniloff. He looked after the retreating figure of the Cabinet Minister with a slight smile at the corner of his lips. "In a time like this," he remarked significantly, "one begins to understand why one of our great writers, was it Bernhardi, I wonder, has written that no island could ever breed a race of diplomatists. The seas which engirdle this island," the Ambassador said thoughtfully, "have brought the English great weal, as they may bring to her much woe. The too nimble brain of the diplomat has its parallel of insincerity in the people whose interests he seems to guard. I believe in the honesty of the English politicians. I have placed that belief on record in the small volume of memoirs which I shall presently entrust to you. But we talk too seriously for a summer afternoon. Let us illustrate to the world our opinion of the political situation, and play another 9 holes at golf." Dominey rose willingly to his feet, and the two men strolled away towards the first tee. "By and by," Terniloff asked, "what of our cheerful little friend Seaman? He ought to be busy just now." "Curiously enough, he is returning from Germany to-night," Dominey announced. "I expect him at Berkeley Square. He is coming direct to me." Chapter 25. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 26 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 26. These were days, to all dwellers in London, of vivid impressions, of poignant memories, reasserting themselves afterwards with a curious sense of unreality, as though belonging to another set of days and another world. Dominey long remembered his dinner that evening in the sombre, handsomely furnished dining-room of his town house in Berkeley Square. Although it lacked the splendid proportions of the banqueting hall at Dominey, it was still a fine apartment, furnished in the Georgian period, with some notable pictures upon the walls, and with a wonderful ceiling and fireplace. Dominey and Rosamund dined alone, and though the table had been reduced to its smallest proportions, The space between them was yet considerable. As soon as Parkins had gravely put the port upon the table, Rosamund rose to her feet, and instead of leaving the room, pointed for the servant to place a chair for her by Dominey's side. "I shall be like your men friends, Everard," she declared, "when the ladies have left, and draw up to your side. Now, what do we do? Tell stories? I promise you that I will be a wonderful listener." "First of all, you drink half a glass of this port," he declared, filling her glass. "Then you peel me one of those peaches, and we divide it. After which we listen for a ring at the bell. To-night I expect a visitor." "A visitor?" "Not a social one," he assured her. "A matter of business which I fear will take me from you for the rest of the evening. So let us make the most of the time until he comes." She commenced her task with the peach, talking to him all the time a little gravely, a sweet and picturesque picture of a graceful and very desirable woman, her delicate shape and artistic fragility more than ever accentuated by the sombreness of the background. "Do you know, Everard," she said, "I am so happy in London here with you, and I feel all the time so strong and well. I can read and understand the books which were a maze of print to me before. I can see the things in the pictures, and feel the thrill of the music, which seemed to come to me, somehow, before, all dislocated and discordant. You understand, dear?" "Of course," he answered gravely. "I do not wonder," she went on, "that Dr. Harrison is proud of me for a patient, but there are many times when I feel a dull pain in my heart because I know that, whatever he or anybody else might say, I am not quite cured." "Rosamund, dear," he protested. "Ah, but don't interrupt," she insisted, depositing his share of the peach upon his plate. "How can I be cured when all the time there is the problem of you? The problem which I am just as far off solving as ever I was. Often I find myself comparing you with the Everard whom I married." "Do I fail so often to come up to his standard?" he asked. "You never fail," she answered, looking at him with brimming eyes. "Of course, he was very much more affectionate," she went on after a moment's pause. "His kisses were not like yours, and he was far fonder of having me with him. Then, on the other hand, often when I wanted him he was not there. He did wild things, mad things. He seemed to forget me altogether. It was that," she went on, "that was so terrible. It was that which made me so nervous. I think that I should even have been able to stand those awful moments when he came back to me covered with blood and reeling, if it had not been that I was already almost a wreck. You know, he killed Roger Unthank that night. That is why he was never able to come back." "Why do you talk of these things to-night, Rosamund?" Dominey begged. "I must, dear," she insisted, laying her fingers upon his hand and looking at him curiously. "I must, even though I see how they distress you. It is wonderful that you should mind so much, Everard, but you do, and I love you for it." "Mind?" he groaned. "Mind! You are so like him. And yet so different," she went on meditatively. "You drink so little wine. You are always so self-controlled, so serious. You live as though you had a life around you of which others knew nothing. The Everard I remember would never have cared about being a magistrate or going into Parliament. He would have spent his time racing or yachting, hunting or shooting, as the fancy took him. And yet—" "And yet what?" Dominey asked, a little hoarsely. "I think he loved me better than you," she said very sadly. "Why?" he demanded. "I cannot tell you," she answered with her eyes upon her plate, "but I think that he did." Dominey walked suddenly to the window and leaned out. There were drops of moisture upon his forehead. He felt the fierce need of air. When he came back, she was still sitting there, still looking down. "I have spoken to Dr. Harrison about it," she went on, her voice scarcely audible. "He told me that you probably loved more than you dared to show, because some day the real Everard might come back." "That is quite true," he reminded her softly. "He may come back at any moment." She gripped his hand. Her voice shook with passion. She leaned towards him, Her other arm stole around his neck. "But I don't want him to come back," she cried. "I want you." Dominey sat for a moment motionless, like a figure of stone. Through the wide-flung, blind-shielded windows came the raucous cry of a newsboy, breaking the stillness of the summer evening. And then another and sharper interruption, the stopping of a taxicab outside, the firm, insistent ringing of the front door-bell. Recollection came to Dominey, and a great strength. The fire which had leaped up within him was thrust back. His response to her wave of passion was infinitely tender. "Dear Rosamund," he said, "that front door-bell summons me to a rather important interview. Will you please trust in me a little while longer? Believe me, I am not in any way cold. I am not indifferent. There is something which you will have to be told, something with which I never reckoned, something which is beginning to weigh upon me night and day. Trust me, Rosamund, and wait." She sank back into her chair with a piquant and yet pathetic little grimace. "You tell me always to wait," she complained. "I will be patient, but you shall tell me this. You are so kind to me. You make or mar my life. You must care a little. Please?" He was standing up now. He kissed her hands fondly. His voice had all the old ring in it. "More than for any woman on earth, dear Rosamund." Seaman, in a light grey suit, a Panama and a white beflowered tie, had lost something of the placid urbanity of a few months ago. He was hot and tired with travel. There were new lines in his face and a queer expression of anxiety about his eyes, at the corners of which little wrinkles had begun to appear. He responded to Dominey's welcome with a fervour which was almost feverish, scrutinized him closely, as though expecting to find some change, and finally sank into an easy-chair with a little gesture of relief. He had been carrying a small brown dispatch case, which he laid on the carpet by his side. "You have news?" Dominey asked. "Yes," was the momentous reply. "I have news." Dominey rang the bell. He had already surmised, from the dressing-case and coats in the hall, that his visitor had come direct from the station. "What will you have?" he inquired. "A bottle of hock with seltzer water, and ice if you have it," Seaman replied. "Also a plate of cold meat, but it must be served here. And afterwards the biggest cigar you have. I have indeed news. News disturbing. News magnificent. News astounding." Dominey gave some orders to the servant who answered his summons. For a few moments they spoke trivialities of the journey. When everything was served, however, and the door closed, Seaman could wait no longer. His appetite, his thirst, his speech seemed all stimulated to swift action. "We are of the same temperament," he said, "that I know. We will speak first of what is more than disturbing, a little terrifying. The mystery of Johann Wolff has been solved." "The man who came to us with messages from Schmidt in South Africa?" Dominey asked. "I had almost forgotten about him." "The same. What was at the back of his visit to us that night I cannot even now imagine. Neither is it clear why he held aloof from me, who am his superior in practically the same service. There we are, from the commencement, confronted with a very singular happening, but scarcely so singular as the denouement. Wolff vanished from your house that night into an English fortress." "It seems incredible," Dominey declared bluntly. "It is nevertheless true," Seaman insisted. "No member of our service is allowed to remain more than 1 month without communicating his existence and whereabouts to headquarters. No word has been received from Wolff since that night in January. On the other hand, indirect information has reached us that he is in durance over here." "But such a thing is against the law, unheard of," Dominey protested. "No country can keep the citizen of another country in prison without formulating a definite charge or bringing him up for trial." Seaman smiled grimly. "That's all very well in any ordinary case," he said. "Wolff has been a marked man for years, though. Wilhelmstrasse would soon make fuss enough, if it were of any use, but it would not be. There are 1 or 2 Englishmen in German prisons at the present moment, concerning whose welfare the English Foreign Office has not even thought it worth while to inquire. What troubles me more than the actual fact of Wolff's disappearance is the mystery of his visit to you, and his apprehension practically on the spot." "They must have tracked him down there," Dominey remarked. "Yes, but they couldn't thrust a pair of tongs into your butler's sitting room, extract Johann Wolff, and set him down inside Norwich Castle, or whatever prison he may be in," Seaman objected. "However, the most disquieting feature about Wolff is that it introduces something we don't understand. For the rest, we have many men as good and better, and the time for their utility is past. You are our greatest hope now, Dominey. It is to be, then?" Seaman took a long and ecstatic draught of his hock and seltzer. "It is to be," he declared solemnly. "There was never any doubt about it. If Russia ceases to mobilize tomorrow, if every statesman in Servia crawls to Vienna with a rope around his neck, the result would still be the same. The word has gone out. The whole of Germany is like a vast military camp. It comes exactly 12 months before the final day fixed by our great authorities, but the opportunity is too great, too wonderful for hesitation. By the end of August we shall be in Paris." "You bring news indeed," Dominey murmured, standing for a moment by the open window. "I have been received with favour in the very loftiest circles," Seaman continued. "You and I both stand high in the list of those to whom great reward shall come. His Majesty approves altogether of your reluctance to avail yourself of his permission to wed the Princess Eiderstrom. Von Ragastein has decided well," he declared. "These are not the days for marriage or giving in marriage. These, the most momentous days the world has ever known, the days when an empire shall spring into being, the mightiest since the continents fell into shape and the stars looked down upon this present world. Those are the words of the All-Highest. In his eyes the greatest of all attributes is singleness of purpose. You followed your own purpose, contrary to my advice, contrary to Terniloff's. You will gain by it." Seaman finished his meal in due course, and the tray was removed. Soon the 2 men were alone again, Seaman puffing out dense volumes of smoke, gripping his cigar between his teeth, brandishing it sometimes in his hand to give effect to his words. A little of his marvellous caution seemed to have deserted him. For the first time he spoke directly to his companion. "Von Ragastein," he said, "it is a great country, ours. It is a wonderful empire we shall build. Tonight I am on fire with the mighty things. I have a list of instructions for you, many details. They can wait. We will talk of our future, our great and glorious destiny as the mightiest nation who has ever earned for herself the right to govern the world. You would think that in Germany there was excitement. There is none. The task of everyone is allotted, their work made clear to them. Like a mighty piece of gigantic machinery, we move towards war. Every regiment knows its station. Every battery commander knows his positions. Every general knows his exact line of attack. Rations, clothing, hospitals, every unit of which you can think, has its movements calculated out for it to the last nicety." "And the final result?" Dominey asked. "Is that also calculated?" Seaman, with trembling fingers, unlocked the little dispatch box which stood by his side, and took from it jealously a sheet of linen-backed parchment. "You, my friend," he said, "are one of the first to gaze upon this. This will show you the dream of our Kaiser. This will show you the framework of the empire that is to be." He laid out a map upon the table. The 2 men bent over it. It was a map of Europe in which England, a diminished France, Spain, Portugal, and Italy were painted in dark blue. For the rest, the whole of the space included between 2 lines, one from Hamburg to Athens, the other from Finland to the Black Sea, was painted a deep scarlet, with here and there portions of it in slightly lighter colouring. Seaman laid his palm upon the map. "There lies our future empire," he said solemnly and impressively. "Explain it to me," Dominey begged. "Broadly speaking, Everything between those two lines belongs to the new German Empire. Poland, Courland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine will possess a certain degree of autonomous government, which will practically amount to nothing. Asia is there at our feet. No longer will Great Britain control the supplies of the world. Raw materials of every description will be ours. Leather, tallow, wheat, oil, fats, timber, they are all there for us to draw upon. And for wealth, India and China. What more could you have, my friend? You take my breath away. But what about Austria? Seaman's grin was almost sardonic. Austria, he said, must already feel her doom creeping upon her. There is no room in Middle Europe for two empires, and the House of Habsburg must fall before the House of Hohenzollern. Austria, body and soul, must become part of the German Empire. Then, further down, mark you, Romania must become a vassal state or be conquered. Bulgaria is already ours. Turkey, with Constantinople, is pledged. Greece will either join us or be wiped out. Serbia will be blotted from the map, possibly also Montenegro. These countries, which are painted in fainter red, like Turkey, Bulgaria, and Greece, become vassal states, to be absorbed one by one as opportunity presents itself. Dominey's finger strayed northward. Belgium, he observed, has disappeared. Belgium we shall occupy and enslave, Seaman replied. Our line of advance into France lies that way, and we need her ports to dominate the Thames. Holland and the Scandinavian countries, as you observe, are left in the lighter shade of red. If an opportunity occurs, Holland and Denmark may be incited to take the field against us. If they do so, it means absorption. If they remain, as they probably will, scared neutrals, they will none the less be our vassal states when the last gun has been fired. And Norway and Sweden? Seaman looked down at the map and smiled. Look at them, he said. They lie at our mercy. Norway has her western seaboard, and there might always be the question of British aid so far as she is concerned. But Sweden is ours, body and soul. More than any other of these vassal states, it is our master's plan to bring her into complete subjection. We need her lusty manhood, the finest cannon food in the world, for later wars, if indeed such a thing should be. She has timber and minerals which we also need. But there, it is enough. First of all men in this country, my friend, you, von Ragastein, have gazed upon this picture of the future. This is marvelously conceived, Dominey muttered. But what of Russia with her millions? How is it that we propose, notwithstanding her countless millions of men, to help ourselves to her richest provinces, to drive a way through the heart of her empire? This, Seaman replied, is where genius steps in. Russia has been ripe for a revolution any time for the last 15 years. We have secret agents now in every city and country place and throughout the army. We shall teach Russia how to make herself a free country. Dominey shivered a little with an almost involuntary repulsion. For the second time that almost satyr-like grin on Seaman's face revolted him. And what of my own work? Seaman helped himself to a liqueur. He was, as a rule, a moderate man, but this was the third time he had replenished his glass since his hasty meal. My brain is weary, friend, he admitted, passing his hand over his forehead. I have a great fatigue. The thoughts jump about. This last week has been one of fierce excitements. Everything, almost your daily life, has been planned. We shall go over it within a day or so. Meanwhile, remember this. It is our great aim to keep England out of the war. Terniloff is right, then, after all, Dominey exclaimed. Seaman laughed scornfully. If we want England out of the war, he pointed out, it is not that we desire her friendship. It is that we may crush her the more easily when Calais, Boulogne, and Havre are in our hands. That will be in 3 months' time. Then perhaps our attitude towards England may change a little. Now I go. Dominey folded up the map with reluctance. His companion shook his head. It was curious that he, too, for the first time in his life upon the same day, addressed his host differently. Baron von Ragastein, he said, There are 6 of those maps in existence. That one is for you. Lock it away and guard it as though it were your greatest treasure on earth, but when you are alone, bring it out and study it. It shall be your inspiration. It shall lighten your moments of depression, give you courage when you are in danger. It shall fill your mind with pride and wonder. It is yours." Dominey folded it carefully up, crossed the room, unlocked a little safe, and deposited it therein. "I shall guard it according to your behest, as my greatest treasure," he assured his departing guest, with a fervor which surprised even himself. End of chapter 26. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 27 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 27. There was something dramatic, in the most lurid sense of the word, about the brief telephone message which Dominey received, not so many hours later, from Carlton House Terrace. In a few minutes he was moving through the streets, still familiar, yet already curiously changed. Men and women were going about their business as usual, but an air of stupefaction was everywhere apparent. Practically every loiterer was studying a newspaper. Every chance acquaintance had stopped to confer with his fellows. War, alternately the joke and bogey of the conversationalist, stretched her grey hands over the sunlit city. Even the lightest hearted felt a thrill of apprehension at the thought of the horrors that were to come. In a day or two all this was to be changed. People went about then counting the Russian millions. The steamroller fetish was to be evolved. The most peaceful stockbroker or shopkeeper, who had never even been to a review in his life, could make calculations of manpower with the stump of a pencil on the back of an old envelope, which would convince the greatest pessimist that Germany and Austria were outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. But on this particular morning people were too stunned for calculations. The incredible had happened. The long-discussed war, the nightmare of the nervous, the derision of the optimist, had actually materialized. The happy-go-lucky years of peace and plenty had suddenly come to an end. Black tragedy leaned over the land. Dominey, avoiding acquaintances as far as possible, his own mind in a curious turmoil, passed down St. James Street and along Pall Mall, and presented himself at Carlton House Terrace. Externally, the great white building, with its rows of flower boxes, showed no signs of undue perturbation. Inside, however, the anteroom was crowded with callers, and it was only by the intervention of Terniloff's private secretary, who was awaiting him, that Dominey was able to reach the inner sanctum where the ambassador was busy dictating letters. He broke off immediately his visitor was announced and dismissed everyone, including his secretaries. Then he locked the door. "Von Ragastein," he groaned, "I am a broken man." Dominey grasped his hand sympathetically. Terniloff seemed to have aged years even in the last few hours. "I sent for you," he continued, "to say farewell and make a confession. You were right, and I was wrong. It would have better if I had remained and played the country farmer on my estates. I was never shrewd enough to see until now that I have been made the cat's paw of the very men whose policy I always condemned." His visitor still remained silent. There was so little that he could say. "I have worked for peace," Terniloff went on, "believing that my country wanted peace. I have worked for peace with honorable men who were just as anxious as I was to secure it. But all the time those for whom I labored were making faces behind my back. I was nothing more nor less than their tool. I now know that nothing in this world could have hindered what is coming. Everyone will at least realize," Dominey reminded him, "that you did your best for peace." "That is one reason why I sent for you," was the agitated reply. "Not long ago I spoke of a little volume, a diary which I have been keeping of my work in this country. I promised to show it to you. You have asked me for it several times lately. I am going to show it to you now. It is written up to yesterday. It will tell you of all my efforts and how they were foiled. It is an absolutely faithful narrative of my work here, and the English response to it." The Prince crossed the room, unlocked one of the smaller safes which stood against the side of the wall, withdrew a morocco-bound volume the size of a small portfolio, and returned it to Dominey. "I beg you," he said earnestly, "to read this with the utmost care, and to await my instructions with regard to it. You can judge, no doubt," he went on a little bitterly, "why I give it into your keeping. Even the Embassy here is not free from our own spies, and the existence of these memoirs is known. The moment I reach Germany, their fate is assured. I am a German and a patriot, although my heart is bitter against those who are bringing this blot upon our country. For that reason these memoirs must be kept in a safe place until I see a good use for them." "You mean if the governing party in Germany should change?" "Precisely. They would then form at once my justification and place English diplomacy in such a light before the saner portion of my fellow countrymen that an honourable peace might be rendered possible. Study them carefully, von Ragastein. Perhaps even your own allegiance to the party you serve may waver for a moment as you read." "I serve no party," Dominey said quietly, "only my country." Terniloff sighed. "Alas, there is no time for us to enter into one of your old arguments on the ethics of government. I must send you away, von Ragastein. You have a terrible task before you. I am bound to wish you Godspeed. For myself, I shall not raise my head again until I have left England." "There is no other commission?" Dominey asked. "No other way in which I can serve you?" "None," Terniloff answered sadly. "I am permitted to suffer no inconveniences. My departure is arranged for as though I were royalty. Yet, believe me, my friend, every act of courtesy and generosity which I receive in these moments bites into my heart. Farewell." Dominey found a taxicab in Pall Mall and drove back to Berkeley Square. He found Rosamund with a little troop of dogs just entering the gardens, and crossed to her side. "Dear," he asked, taking her arm, "would you mind very much coming down to Norfolk for a few days?" "With you?" she asked quickly. "Yes. I want to be in retreat for a short time. There are one or two things I must settle before I take up some fresh work." "I should love it," she declared enthusiastically. "London is getting so hot, and everyone is so excited." "I shall order the touring car at 3 o'clock," Dominey told her. "We shall get home about 9. Parkins and your maid can go down by train. Does that suit you?" "Delightfully." He took her arm, and they paced slowly along the hot walk. "Rosamund, dear," he said, "the time has come which many people have been dreading. We are at war." "I know," she murmured. "You and I have had quite a happy time together these last few months," he went on, "even though there is still that black cloud between us. I have tried to treat you as kindly and tenderly as though I were really your husband, and you were indeed my wife." "You're not going away?" she cried, startled. "I couldn't bear that. No one could ever be so sweet as you have been to me." "Dear," he said, "I want you to think of your husband, of Everard. He was a soldier once for a short time, was he not? What do you think he would have done now that this terrible war has come?" "He would have done what you will do," she answered, with the slightest possible tremor in her tone. "He would have become a soldier again. He would have fought for his country." "And so must I fight for my country," he declared. "That is why I must leave you for an hour now while I make some calls. I shall be back to luncheon. Directly afterwards we must start. I have many things to arrange first, though. Life is not going to be very easy for the next few days." She held on to his arm. She seemed curiously reluctant to let him go. "Everard," she said, "when we are at Dominey, shall I be able to see Dr. Harrison?" "Of course," he assured her. "There is something I want to say to him," she confided. "Something I want to ask you, too. Are you the same person, Everard, when you are in town as when you are in the country?" He was a little taken aback at her question, asked, too, with such almost plaintive seriousness. The very aberration it suggested seemed altogether denied by her appearance. She was wearing a dress of black and white muslin, a large black hat, Paris shoes. Her stockings, her gloves, all the trifling details of her toilette were carefully chosen, and her clothes themselves gracefully and naturally worn. Socially, too, she had been amazingly successful. Only the week before, Caroline had come to him with a little shrug of the shoulders. "I have been trying to be kind to Rosamund," she said, "and finding out instead how unnecessary it is. She is quite the most popular of the younger married women in our set. You don't deserve such luck, Everard." "You know the proverb about the old roué," he had replied. His mind had wandered for a moment. He realized Rosamund's question with a little start. "The same person, dear?" he repeated. "I think so. Don't I seem so to you?" She shook her head. "I am not sure," she answered a little mysteriously. "You see, in the country I still remember sometimes that awful night when I so nearly lost my reason. I have never seen you as you looked that night." "You would rather not go back, perhaps?" "That is the strange part of it," she replied. "There is nothing in the world I want so much to do. There's an empty taxi, dear," she added, just as they reached the gate. "I shall go in and tell Justine about the packing." End of chapter 27. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 28 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 28. Within the course of the next few days, a strange rumor spread through Dominey and the district, from the farm laborer to the farmer, from the school children to their homes, from the village post office to the neighboring hamlets. A gang of woodmen from a neighboring county, with an engine and all the machinery of their craft, had started to work razing to the ground everything in the shape of tree or shrub at the north end of the Black Wood. The matter of war was promptly forgotten. Before the second day, every man, woman, and child in the place had paid an odd visit to the outskirts of the wood, had listened to the whir of machinery, had gazed upon the great bridge of planks leading into the wood, had peered, in the hope of some strange discovery, into the tents of the men who were camping out. The men themselves were not communicative, and the first time the foreman had been known to open his mouth was when Dominey walked down to discuss progress on the morning after his arrival. "It's a dirty bit of work, sir," he confided. "I don't know as I ever came across a bit of woodland as was so utterly, hopelessly rotten. Why, the wood crumbles when you touch it, and the men have to be within reach of one another the whole of the time, though we've a matter of 500 planks down there. Come across anything unusual yet?" "We ain't come across anything that isn't unusual so far, sir. My men are all wearing extra leggins to keep them from being bitten by them adders, as long as my arm, some of 'em, and there's fungus there which, when you touch it, sends out a smell enough to make a man faint. We killed a cat the first day, as big and as fierce as a young tigress. It's a queer job, sir." "How long will it take?" "Matter of 3 weeks, sir, and when you've got the timber out you'll be well advised to burn it. It's not worth a snap of the fingers. Begging your pardon, sir," the man went on, "the old lady in the distance there hangs about the whole of the time. Some of my men are half scared of her." Dominey swung around. On a mound a little distance away in the park, Rachel Unthank was standing. In her rusty black clothes, unrelieved by any trace of colour, her white cheeks and strange eyes, even in the morning light, she was a repellent figure. Dominey strolled across to her. "You see, Mrs. Unthank," he began. She interrupted him. Her skinny hand was stretched out towards the wood. "What are those men doing, Sir Everard Dominey?" she demanded. What is your will with the wood?" "I am carrying out a determination I came to in the winter," Dominey replied. "Those men are going to cut and hew their way from one end of the Black Wood to the other, until not a tree or a bush remains upright. As they cut, they burn. Afterwards I shall have it drained. We may live to see a field of corn there, Mrs. Unthank." "You will dare to do this?" she asked hoarsely. "Will you dare to tell me why I should not, Mrs. Unthank?" She relapsed into silence, and Dominey passed on. But that night, as Rosamund and he were lingering over their dessert, enjoying the strange quiet and the wonderful breeze which crept in at the open window, Parkins announced a visitor. "Mrs. Unthank is in the library, sir," he announced. "She would be glad if you could spare her 5 minutes." Rosamund shivered slightly, but nodded as Dominey glanced towards her inquiringly. "Don't let her see me, please," she begged. "You must go, of course, Everard." "Yes, dear?" "I know what you are doing out there, although you have never said a word to me about it," she continued, with an odd little note of passion in her tone. "Don't let her persuade you to stop. Let them cut and burn and hew till there isn't room for a mouse to hide. You promise?" "I promise," he answered. Mrs. Unthank was making every effort to keep under control her fierce discomposure. She rose as Dominey entered the room and dropped an old-fashioned curtsy. "Well, Mrs. Unthank," he enquired, "what can I do for you?" "It's about the wood again, sir," she confessed. "I can't bear it. All night long I seem to hear those axes and the calling of the men." "What is your objection, Mrs. Unthank, to the destruction of the Black Wood?" Dominey asked bluntly. "It is nothing more nor less than a noisome pest hole. Its very presence there, after all that she has suffered, is a menace to Lady Dominey's nerves. I am determined to sweep it from the face of the earth." The forced respect was already beginning to disappear from her manner. "There's evil will come to you if you do, Sir Everard," she declared doggedly. "Plenty of evil has come to me from that wood as it is," he reminded her. "You mean to disturb the spirit of him whose body you threw there?" she persisted. Dominey looked at her calmly. Some sort of evil seemed to have lit in her face. Her lips had shrunk apart, showing her yellow teeth. The fire in her narrowed eyes was the fire of hatred. "I am no murderer, Mrs. Unthank," he said. "Your son stole out from the shadow of that wood, attacked me in a cowardly manner, and we fought. He was mad when he attacked me. He fought like a madman, and, notwithstanding my superior strength, I was glad to get away alive. I never touched his body. It lay where he fell. If he crept into the wood and died there, then his death was not at my door. He sought for my life, as I never sought for his." "You've done him wrong," the woman muttered. "That again is false. His passion for Lady Dominey was uninvited and unreciprocated. Her only feeling concerning him was one of fear. That the whole countryside knows. Your son was a lonely, a morose, and an ill-living man, Mrs. Unthank. If either of us had murder in our hearts, it was he, not I. And as for you," Dominey went on, after a moment's pause, "I think that you have had your revenge, Mrs. Unthank. It was you who nursed my wife into insanity. It was you who fed her with the horror of your son's so-called spirit. I think that if I had stayed away another 2 years, Lady Dominey would have been in a madhouse to-day." "I would to heaven," the woman cried, "that you'd rotted to death in Africa." "You carry your evil feelings far, Mrs. Unthank," he replied. "Take my advice. Give up this foolish idea that the Black Wood is still the home of your son's spirit. Go and live on your annuity in another part of the country, and forget." He moved across the room to throw open a window. Her eyes followed him wonderingly. "I have heard a rumour," she said slowly. "There has been a word spoken here and there about you. I've had my doubts sometimes. I have them again every time you speak. Are you really Everard Dominey?" He swung around and faced her. "Who else?" "There's one," she went on, "has never believed it, and that's her ladyship. I've heard strange talk from the people who've come under your masterful ways. You're a harder man than the Everard Dominey I remember. What if you should be an impostor?" "You have only to prove that, Mrs. Unthank," Dominey replied, "and a portion, at any rate, of the Black Wood may remain standing. You will find it a little difficult, though. You must excuse my ringing the bell. I see no object in asking you to remain longer." She rose unwillingly to her feet. Her manner was sullen and unyielding. "You are asking for the evil things," she warned him. "Be assured," Dominey answered, "that if they come, I shall know how to deal with them." Dominey found Rosamund and Doctor Harrison, who had walked over from the village, lingering on the terrace. He welcomed the latter warmly. "You are a godsend, Doctor," he declared. "I have been obliged to leave my port untasted for want of a companion. You will excuse us for a moment, Rosamund?" She nodded pleasantly, and the doctor followed his host into the dining room and took his seat at the table where the dessert still remained. "Old woman threatening mischief?" the latter asked, with a keen glance from under his shaggy grey eyebrows. "I think she means it," Dominey replied, as he filled his guest's glass. "Personally," he went on after a moment's pause, "the present situation is beginning to confirm an old suspicion of mine. I am a hard and fast materialist, you know, Doctor, in certain matters, and I have not the slightest faith in the vindictive mother, terrified to death lest the raising of a wood of unwholesome character should turn out into the cold world the spirit of her angel son." "What do you believe?" the doctor asked bluntly. "I would rather not tell you at the present moment," Dominey answered. "It would sound too fantastic." "Your note this afternoon spoke of urgency," the doctor observed. "The matter is urgent. I want you to do me a great favour, to remain here all night." "You are expecting something to happen?" "I wish at any rate to be prepared." "I'll stay with pleasure," the doctor promised. "You can lend me some paraphernalia, I suppose? And give me a shakedown somewhere near Lady Dominey. By the by," he began, and hesitated. "I have followed your advice, or rather your orders," Dominey interrupted a little harshly. "It has not always been easy, especially in London, where Rosamund is away from these associations. I am hoping great things from what may happen tonight, or very soon." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "I shouldn't wonder if you weren't on the right track," he declared. Rosamund came in through the window to them and seated herself by Dominey's side. "Why are you two whispering like conspirators?" she demanded. "Because we are conspirators," he replied lightly. "I have persuaded Doctor Harrison to stay the night. He would like a room in our wing. Will you let the maids know, dear?" She nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. There are several rooms quite ready. Mrs. Midgley thought that we might be bringing down some guests. I am quite sure that we can make Doctor Harrison comfortable." "No doubt about that, Lady Dominey," the doctor declared. "Let me be as near to your apartment as possible." There was a shade of anxiety in her face. "You think that tonight something will happen?" she asked. "Tonight or one night very soon," Dominey assented. "It is just as well for you to be prepared. You will not be afraid, dear? You will have the doctor on one side of you, and me on the other." "I am only afraid of one thing," she answered a little enigmatically. "I have been so happy lately." Dominey changed into ordinary morning clothes, with a thick cord tied round his body, a revolver in his pocket, and a loaded stick in his hand, spent the remainder of the night and part of the early morning concealed behind a great clump of rhododendrons, his eyes fixed upon the shadowy stretch of park which lay between the house and the Black Wood. The night was moonless but clear, and when his eyes were once accustomed to the pale but sombre twilight, the whole landscape and the moving objects upon it were dimly visible. The habits of his years of bush life seemed instinctively, in those few hours of waiting, to have re-established themselves. Every sense was strained and active. Every night sound, of which the hooting of some owls, disturbed from their lurking place in the Black Wood, was predominant, heard and accounted for. And then, just as he had glanced at his watch and found that it was close upon 2 o'clock, came the first real intimation that something was likely to happen. Moving across the park towards him He heard the sound of a faint patter, curious and irregular in rhythm, which came from behind a range of low hillocks. He raised himself up on his hands and knees to watch. His eyes were fastened upon a certain spot, a stretch of the open park between himself and the hillocks. The patter ceased and began again. Into the open there came a dark shape, the irregularity of its movements swiftly explained. It moved at first upon all fours, then on two legs, then on all fours again. It crept nearer and nearer, and Dominey, as he watched, laid aside his stick. It reached the terrace, paused beneath Rosamund's window, now barely half a dozen yards from where he was crouching. Deliberately he waited for what he knew must soon come. Then the deep silence of the breathless night was broken by that familiar, unearthly scream. Dominey waited till even its echoes had died away. Then he ran a few steps, bent double, and stretched out his hands. Once more, for the last time, that devil's cry broke the deep stillness of the August morning, throbbing a little as though with a new fear, dying away as though the fingers which crushed it back down the straining throat had indeed crushed with it the last flicker of some unholy life. When Dr. Harrison made his hurried appearance a few moments later, he found Dominey seated upon the terrace, furiously smoking a cigarette. On the ground a few yards away lay something black and motionless. "What is it?" the doctor gasped. For the first time Dominey showed some signs of a lack of self-control. His voice was choked and uneven. "Go and look at it, doctor," he said. "It's tied up, hand and foot. You can see where the spirit of Roger Unthank has hidden itself." "Bosh!" the doctor answered with grim contempt. "It's Roger Unthank himself, the beast!" A little stream of servants came running out. Dominey gave a few orders quickly. "Ring up the garage," he directed, "and I shall want one of the men to go into Norwich to the hospital. Doctor, will you go up and see Lady Dominey?" The habits of a lifetime broke down. Parkins, the immaculate, the silent, the perfect automaton, asked an eager question. "What is it, sir?" There was the sound of a window opening overhead. At that moment Parkins would not have asked in vain for an annuity. Dominey glanced at the little semicircle of servants and raised his voice. "It is the end, I trust, of these foolish superstitions about Roger Unthank's ghost. There lies Roger Unthank, half beast, half man. For some reason or other, some lunatic's reason of course, he has chosen to hide himself in the Black Wood all these years. His mother, I presume, has been his accomplice and taken him food. He is still alive, but in a disgusting state." There was a little awed murmur. Dominey's voice had become quite matter-of-fact. "I suppose," he continued, "his first idea was to revenge himself upon us and this household, by whom he imagined himself badly treated. The man, however, was half a madman when he came to the neighbourhood, and has behaved like one ever since. Johnson," Dominey continued, singling out a sturdy footman with sound common sense, "get ready to take this creature into Norwich Hospital. Say that if I do not come in during the day, a letter of explanation will follow from me. The rest of you, with the exception of Parkins, please go to bed." With little exclamations of wonder they began to disperse. Then one of them paused and pointed across the park. Moving with incredible swiftness came the gaunt, black figure of Rachel Unthank, swaying sometimes on her feet, yet in their midst before they could realize it. She staggered to the prostrate body and threw herself upon her knees. Her hands rested upon the unseen face. Her eyes glared across at Dominey. "So you've got him at last!" she gasped. "Mrs. Unthank," Dominey said sternly, "you are in time to accompany your son to the hospital at Norwich. The car will be here in 2 minutes. I have nothing to say to you. Your own conscience should be sufficient punishment for keeping that poor creature alive in such a fashion, and ministering during my absence to his accursed desire for vengeance." "He would have died if I hadn't brought him food," she muttered. "I have wept all the tears a woman's broken heart could wring out, beseeching him to come back to me." "Yet," Dominey insisted, You shared his foul plot for vengeance against a harmless woman. You let him come and make ghoulish noises, night by night, under these windows without a word of remonstrance. You knew very well what their accursed object was. You, with a delicate woman in your charge, who trusted you. You are an evil pair, but of the two you are worse than your half-witted son." The woman made no reply. She was still on her knees, bending over the prostrate figure, from whose lips now came a faint moaning. Then the lights of the car flashed out as it left the garage, passed through the iron gates, and drew up a few yards away. "Help him in," Dominey ordered. "You can loosen his cords, Johnson, as soon as you have started. He has very little strength. Tell them at the hospital I shall probably be there during the day or tomorrow." With a little shiver the two men stooped to their task. Their prisoner muttered to himself all the time, but made no resistance. Rachel Unthank, as she stepped in to take her place by his side, turned once more to Dominey. She was a broken woman. "You're rid of us," she sobbed, "perhaps forever. You've said harsh things of both of us. Roger isn't always so bad. Sometimes he's more gentle than at others. You'd have thought then that he was just a baby, living there for love of the wind and the trees and the birds. If he comes to—" Her voice broke. Dominey's reply was swift and not unkind. He pointed to the window above. "If Lady Dominey recovers, you and your son are forgiven. If she never recovers, I wish you both the blackest corner of hell." The car drove off. Dr. Harrison met Dominey on the threshold as he turned towards the house. "Her ladyship is unconscious now," he announced. "Perhaps that is a good sign. I never liked that unnatural calm. She'll be unconscious, I think, for a great many hours. For God's sake, come and get a whisky and soda, and give me one." The early morning sunshine lay upon the park when the two men at last separated. They stood for a moment looking out. From the black wood came the whir of a saw. The little troop of men had left their tents. The crash of a fallen tree heralded their morning's work. "You are still going on with that?" the doctor asked. "To the very last stump of a tree, to the last bush, to the last cluster of weeds," Dominey replied, with a sudden passion in his tone. "I will have that place razed to the bare level of the earth, and I will have its poisonous swamps sucked dry. I have hated that foul spot," he went on, "ever since I realized what suffering it meant to her. My reign here may not be long, Doctor. I have my own tragedy to deal with. But those who come after me will never feel the blight of that accursed place." The doctor grunted. His inner thoughts he kept to himself. "Maybe you're right," he conceded. End of chapter 28. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 29 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 29. The heat of a sulphurous afternoon, a curious parallel in its presage of coming storm to the fast approaching crisis in Dominey's own affairs, had driven Dominey from his study on to the terrace. In a chair by his side lounged Eddie Pelham, immaculate in a suit of white flannels. It was the 5th day since the mystery of the Black Wood had been solved. "Ripping, old chap, of you to have me down here," the young man remarked amiably, his hand stretching out to a tumbler which stood by his side. "The country, when you can get ice, is a paradise in this weather, especially when London's so full of ghastly rumours and all that sort of thing. What's the latest news of her ladyship?" "Still unconscious," Dominey replied. "The doctors, however, seem perfectly satisfied. Everything depends on her waking moments." The young man abandoned the subject with a murmur of hopeful sympathy. His eyes were fixed upon a little cloud of dust in the distance. "Expecting visitors to-day?" he asked. "Should not be surprised," was the somewhat laconic answer. The young man stood up, yawned, and stretched himself. "I'll make myself scarce," he said. "Jove!" he added approvingly, lingering for a moment. "Jolly well cut. the tunic of your uniform, Dominey. If a country in peril ever decides to waive the matter of my indifferent physique and send me out to the rescue, I should go to your man." Dominey smiled. "Mine is only the local yeomanry rig-out," he replied. "They will nab you for the Guards." Dominey stepped back through the open windows into his study as Pelham strolled off. He was seated at his desk poring over some letters when a few minutes later Seaman was ushered into the room. For a single moment his muscles tightened, his frame became tense. Then he realized his visitor's outstretched hands of welcome, and he relaxed. Seaman was perspiring, vociferous and excited. "At last!" he exclaimed. "Donner und my God, Dominey, what is this?" 13 years ago, Dominey explained, I resigned a commission in the Norfolk Yeomanry. That little matter, however, has been adjusted. At a crisis like this—" "My friend, you are wonderful," Seaman interrupted solemnly. "You are a man after my own heart. You are thorough. You leave nothing undone. That is why," he added, lowering his voice a little, "we are the greatest race in the world. Drink before everything, my friend," he went on. "Drink I must have. What a day! The very clouds that hide the sun are full of sulphurous heat." Dominey rang the bell, ordered hock and seltzer and ice. Seaman drank and threw himself into an easy-chair. "There is no fear of your being called out of the country because of that, I hope?" he asked, a little anxiously, nodding his head towards his companion's uniform. "Not at present," Dominey answered. "I am a trifle over-aged to go with the first batch or two. Where have you been?" Seaman hitched his chair a little nearer. "In Ireland," he confided. "Sorry to desert you as I did, but you do not begin to count for us just yet." There was just a faint doubt as to what they were going to do about internment. That is why I had to get the Irish trip off my mind. "What has been decided?" "The Government has the matter under consideration," Seaman replied with a chuckle. "I can certainly give myself 6 months before I need to slip off. Now tell me, why do I find you down here?" "After Terniloff left," Dominey explained, "I felt I wanted to get away. I have been asked to start some recruiting work down here." "Terniloff left his little volume with you?" "Yes." "Where is it?" "Safe," Dominey replied. Seaman mopped his forehead. "It needs to be," he muttered. "I have orders to see it destroyed. We can talk of that presently. Sometimes, when I am away from you, I tremble. It may sound foolish, but you have in your possession just the two things, that map and Von Terniloff's memoirs, which would wreck our propaganda in every country of the world." "Both are safe," Dominey assured him. "By the by, my friend," he went on, "do you know that you yourself are forgetting your usual caution?" "In what respect?" Seaman demanded quickly. "As you stooped to sit down just now, I instinctively saw the shape of your revolver in your hip pocket. You know as well as I do that with your name, and the fact that you are only a naturalized Englishman, it is inexcusably foolish to be carrying firearms about just now." Seaman thrust his hand into his pocket and threw the revolver upon the table. "You are quite right," he acknowledged. "Take care of it for me. I took it with me to Ireland because one never knows what may happen in that amazing country." Dominey swept it carelessly into the drawer of the desk at which he was sitting. "Our weapons, from now on," Seaman continued, "must be the weapons of guile and craft. You and I will have, alas, to see less of one another, Dominey. In many ways it is unfortunate that we have not been able to keep England out of this for a few more months. However, the situation must be dealt with as it exists. So far as you are concerned, you have practically secured yourself against suspicion. You will hold a brilliant and isolated place amongst those who are serving the great warlord. When I do approach you, it will be for sympathy and assistance against the suspicions of those far-seeing Englishmen." Dominey nodded. "You will stay the night?" he asked. "If I may," Seaman assented. "It is the last time for many months when it will be wise for us to meet on such intimate terms. Perhaps our dear friend Parkins will take vinous note of the occasion." "In other words," Dominey said, "you propose that we shall drink the Dominey cabinet hock and the Dominey port to the glory of our country." "To the glory of our country," Seaman echoed. "So be it, my friend. Listen!" A car had passed along the avenue in front of the house. There was the sound of voices in the hall, a knock at the door, the rustle of a woman's clothes. Parkins, a little disturbed, announced the arrivals. The Princess of Eiderstrom and a gentleman. The Princess said that her errand with you was urgent, sir," he added, turning apologetically towards his master. The Princess was already in the room, and following her a short man in a suit of sombre black, wearing a white tie and carrying a black bowler hat. He blinked across the room through his thick glasses, and Dominey knew that the end had come. The door was closed behind them. The Princess came a little further into the room. Her hand was extended towards Dominey, but not in greeting. Her white finger pointed straight at him. She turned to her companion. "Which is that, Dr. Schmidt?" she demanded. "The Englishman, by Gott!" Schmidt answered. The silence which reigned for several seconds was intense and profound. The coolest of all four was perhaps Dominey. The Princess was pale with a passion which seemed to sob behind her words. "Everard Dominey!" she cried. "What have you done with my lover? What have you done with Leopold von Ragastein?" "He met with the fate," Dominey replied, "which he had prepared for me. We fought, and I conquered." "You killed him?" "I killed him," Dominey echoed. "It was a matter of necessity. His body sleeps on the bed of the Blue River." "And your life here has been a lie." "On the contrary, it has been the truth," Dominey objected. "I assured you at the Carlton, when you first spoke to me, and I have assured you a dozen times since, that I was Everard Dominey. That is my name. That is who I am." Seaman's voice seemed to come from a long way off. For the moment the man had neither courage nor initiative. He seemed as though he had received some sort of stroke. His mind was travelling backwards. "You came to me at Cape Town," he muttered. "You had all von Ragastein's letters. You knew his history. You had the Imperial mandate." "Von Ragastein and I exchanged the most intimate confidences in his camp," Dominey said, "as Dr. Schmidt there knows. I told him my history, and he told me his. The letters and papers I took from him." Schmidt had covered his face with his hands for a moment. His shoulders were heaving. "My beloved chief," he sobbed. "My dear, devoted master, killed by that drunken Englishman." "Not so drunk as you fancied him," Dominey said coolly. "Not so far gone in his course of dissipation but that he was able to pull himself up when the great incentive came." The Princess looked from one to the other of the two men. Seaman had still the appearance of a man struggling to extricate himself from some sort of nightmare. "My first and only suspicion," he faltered, "was that night when Wolff disappeared." "Wolff's coming was rather a tragedy," Dominey admitted. "Fortunately, I had a Secret Service man in the house who was able to dispose of him." "It was you who planned his disappearance?" Seaman gasped. "Naturally," Dominey replied. "He knew the truth and was trying all the time to communicate with you." "And the money," Seaman continued, blinking rapidly. £100,000 and more?" "I understood that was a gift," Dominey replied. "If the German Secret Service, however, cares to formulate a claim and sue me—" The Princess suddenly erupted. Her eyes seemed on fire. "What are you, you two?" she cried, stretching out her hands towards Schmidt and Seaman. "Are you lumps of earth, clods, creatures without courage and intelligence? You can let him stand there, the Englishman who has murdered my lover, who has befooled you? You let him stand there and mock you, and you do and say nothing? Is his life a sacred thing? Has he none of your secrets in his charge?" "The great God above us!" Seaman groaned, with a sudden white horror in his face. "He has the Prince's memoirs. He has the Kaiser's map." "On the contrary," Dominey replied, "both are deposited at the Foreign Office. We hope to find them very useful a little later on." Seaman sprang forward like a tiger, and went down in a heap as he almost threw himself upon Dominey's outflung fist. Schmidt came stealing across the room, and from underneath his cuff something gleamed. "You are 2-1," the Princess cried passionately, as both assailants hesitated. "I would to God that I had a weapon, or that I were a man." "My dear Princess," a good-humoured voice remarked from the window. 4-2, the other way, I think, what? Eddie Pelham, his hands in his pockets, but a very alert gleam in his usually vacuous face, stood in the window doorway. From behind him, two exceedingly formidable-looking men slipped into the room. There was no fight, not even a struggle. Seaman, who had never recovered from the shock of his surprise, and was now completely unnerved, was handcuffed in a moment, and Schmidt disarmed. The latter was the first to break the curious silence. "What have I done?" he demanded. "Why am I treated like this?" "Dr. Schmidt?" Eddie asked pleasantly. "That is my name, sir," was the fierce reply. "I have just landed from East Africa. We knew nothing of the war when we started. I came to expose that man. He is an impostor, a murderer. He has killed a German nobleman." "He has committed lèse-majesté," Seaman gasped. "He has deceived the Kaiser. He has dared to sit in his presence as the Baron von Ragastein." The young man in flannels glanced across at Dominey and smiled. "I say, you two don't mean to be funny, but you are," he declared. "First of all, there's Dr. Schmidt accuses Sir Everard here of being an impostor because he assumed his own name, accuses him of murdering a man who had planned in cold blood you were in that, by the way, Schmidt to kill him. And then there's our friend here, the secretary of the Society for Propagating Better Relations between the Businessmen of England and Germany, complaining because Sir Everard carried through in Germany, for England, exactly what he believed the Baron von Ragastein was carrying out here, for Germany. You are a curious, thick-headed race, you Germans." "I demand again," Schmidt shouted, "to know by what right I am treated as a criminal." "Because you are one," Eddie answered coolly. "You and Von Ragastein together planned the murder of Sir Everard Dominey in East Africa, and I caught you creeping across the floor just now with a knife in your hand. That'll do for you. Any questions to ask, Seaman?" "None," was the surly reply. "You are well advised," the young man remarked coolly. "Within the last 2 days your house in Forest Hill and your offices in London Wall have been searched." "You have said enough," Seaman declared. "Fate has gone against me. I thank God that our master has abler servants than I, and the strength to crush this island of popinjays and fools." "Popinjays seem severe," Eddie murmured in a hard tone. "However, to get on with this little matter," he added, turning to one of his two subordinates. "You will find a military car outside. Take these men over to the guard-room at the Norwich Barracks. I have arranged for an escort to see them to town. Tell the Colonel I'll be over later in the day." The Princess rose from the chair into which she had subsided a few moments before. Dominey turned towards her. "Princess," he said, "there can be little conversation between us. Yet I shall ask you to remember this. Von Ragastein planned my death in cold blood. I could have slain him as an assassin, without the slightest risk, but I preferred to meet him face to face with the truth upon my lips. It was his life or mine. I fought for my country's sake, as he did for his." The Princess looked at him with glittering eyes. "I shall hate you till the end of my days," she declared, "because you killed the thing I love, but although I am a woman, I know justice. You were chivalrous towards me. You treated Leopold perhaps better than he would have treated you. I pray that I shall never see your face again. Be so good as to suffer me to leave this house at once and unattended." Dominey threw open the windows which led on to the terrace and stood on one side. She passed by without a glance at him and disappeared. Eddie came strolling along the terrace a few moments later. "Nice old ducks, those two, dear heart," he confided. "Seaman has just offered Forsyth, my burly ruffian in the blue serge suit, £100 to shoot him on the pretence that he was escaping." "And what about Schmidt?" "Insisted on his rights as an officer and demanded the front seat and a cigar before the car started. A pretty job, Dominey, and neatly cleaned up." Dominey was watching the dust from the two cars, which were disappearing down the avenue. "Tell me, Eddie," he asked, "there's one thing I have always been curious about. How did you manage to keep that fellow Wolff when there wasn't a war on and he wasn't breaking the law?" The young man grinned. "We had to stretch a point there, old dear," he admitted. "Plans of a fortress, eh?" Do you mean to say that he had plans of a fortress upon him?" Dominey asked. "Picture postcard of Norwich Castle," the young man confided, "but keep it dark. Can I have a drink before I get the little car going?" The turmoil of the day was over, and Dominey, after one silent but passionate outburst of thankfulness at the passing from his life of this unnatural restraint, found all his thoughts absorbed by the struggle which was being fought out in the bedchamber above. The old doctor came down and joined him at dinner time. He met Dominey's eager glance with a little nod. "She's doing all right," he declared. "No fever or anything?" "Bless you, no. She's as near as possible in perfect health physically. A different woman from what she was this time last year, I can tell you. When she wakes up, she'll either be herself again, without a single illusion of any sort, or—" The doctor paused, sipped his wine, emptied his glass, and set it down approvingly. "Or," Dominey insisted, "or that part of her brain will be more or less permanently affected. However, I am hoping for the best. Thank heavens you're on the spot." They finished their dinner almost in silence. Afterwards they smoked for a few minutes upon the terrace. Then they made their way softly upstairs. The doctor parted with Dominey at the door of the latter's room. "I shall remain with her for an hour or so," he said. "After that I shall leave her entirely to herself. You'll be here in case there's a change?" "I shall be here," Dominey promised. The minutes passed into hours, uncounted, unnoticed. Dominey sat in his easy-chair, stirred by a tumultuous wave of passionate emotion. The memory of those earlier days of his return came back to him with all their poignant longings. He felt again the same tearing at the heartstrings, the same strange, unnerving tenderness. The great world's drama, in which he knew that he, too, would surely continue to play his part, seemed like a thing far off, the concern of another race of men. Every fibre of his being seemed attuned to the magic and the music of one wild hope. Yet when there came what he had listened for so long, the hope seemed frozen into fear. He sat a little forward in his easy-chair, his hands gripping its sides, his eyes fixed upon the slowly widening crack in the panel. It was as it had been before. She stooped low, stood up again, and came towards him. From behind, an unseen hand closed the panel. She came to him with her arms outstretched, and all the wonderful things of life and love in her shining eyes. That faint touch of the somnambulist had passed. She came to him as she had never come before. She was a very real and a very live woman. "Everard!" she cried. He took her into his arms. At their first kiss she thrilled from head to foot. For a moment she laid her head upon his shoulder. "Oh, I have been so silly," she confessed. "There were times when I couldn't believe that you were my Everard, mine. And now I know." Her lips sought his again, his parched with the desire of years. Along the corridor, the old doctor tiptoed his way to his room, with a pleased smile upon his face. This is the end of The Great Impersonation, by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Recording by Tom Weiss.